In the 12th century, the world was a mosaic of ancient empires and nascent kingdoms. In China, the Jurchen Jin dynasty held sway over the north, while the southern Song dynasty clung to the south. To the west, the great Islamic empires of the Khwarezmians and the Seljuks dominated Persia and Central Asia. Between these great sedentary civilizations lay an immense ocean of grass, a land of extremes, of brutal winters and scorching summers, stretching from the forests of Siberia to the Gobi Desert. This was the steppe, the homeland of the nomads. This world was governed not by walls and borders, but by the sky and the seasons. The people of the steppe looked to the heavens and saw their supreme deity, Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a vast, impersonal God who ordained the fate of all things below. The land itself was sacred, the domain of the earth's mother, Edigan, her spirit dwelling in the mountains and rivers. Shamans, with their drums and ecstatic trances, served as intermediaries, communing with the countless spirits of the wind, the water, and the ancestors who roamed this untamed wilderness. Life was a perpetual migration. The people followed their herds of horses, sheep, and goats in a constant search for fresh pasture and water. Their homes were not fixed structures of stone or wood, but round, felt tents called gers, or yurts, which could be dismantled and packed onto carts in a matter of hours. The horse was the center of their existence. A steppe nomad learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk. From the saddle, he hunted, he herded, and he fought. The primary weapon was the composite bow, a marvel of engineering made from horn, sinew, and wood, capable of piercing armor at a great distance. The people of this vast land called themselves the people of the felt-walled tents. They were not a single nation, but a fractured and feuding collection of clans and tribes, a constellation of families bound by blood, marriage, and fragile alliances. Names like the Tatars, the Karaite, the Merkit, the Naiman, and the Taishiad were spoken with respect or fear. There was no concept of a unified Mongolia. There was only the clan and the endless cycle of raid and reprisal, a vendetta and blood feud that had defined life on the steppe for generations. It was a world of breathtaking beauty and unrelenting violence, a world that demanded strength, cunning, and an absolute will to survive. It was into this world that a child was born who would not only endure it, but would break it and remake it in his own image. In the heart of this fractured land, near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, and alongside the Anan River, lived the Borjigin, a minor and unassuming clan. Their leader was a man of some renown, a chieftain named Yasug. He was not a great Khan, but a Badr, a title meaning the brave, earned through his prowess in battle. He was a man of ambition in a world where ambition was often a death sentence. Years before, in a daring raid that would set in motion a decades-long blood feud, Yasuge had stolen a wife from a neighboring tribe. He and his brothers had seen her being escorted by her new husband, a chieftain of the Merkit tribe. Seeing her beauty, they gave chase. Her husband, hopelessly outnumbered, urged her to flee, telling her she would find another husband, but he would not find another life. Yasuge took the terrified young woman, whose name was Halan, as his own. She would become his chief wife, a woman of fierce pride and unyielding strength. Around the year 1162, Halan gave birth to her first son. The birth was auspicious, a sign in a world that lived by omens. The baby, it was said, came into the world, clutching a dark clot of blood in his right fist, a speck of coagulated life the size of a knucklebone. A shaman, looking upon the child, saw the future. He saw a great warrior, a conqueror who would hold the world in his grasp. Yasuge had just returned from a successful campaign against the Tatars, a powerful and hated rival tribe who had been a scourge upon his people for generations. In the flush of victory, he had captured a Tatar chieftain. As was the custom, Yasuge gave his newborn son the name of this vanquished enemy. He named him Temujin. Temujin's childhood was the typical upbringing of a nomad boy, but one overshadowed by his father's status and the constant threat of his enemies. He learned to ride a horse before he could properly walk. His small body lashed to the saddle. He was taught to hunt with a bow and arrow, to stalk marmots and birds, learning the patience and the silence of a predator. He learned the complex genealogies of the steppe tribes, the intricate web of alliances, insults, and feuds that governed all relations. He was not a remarkable child in appearance. He was tall for his age, with a broad forehead and intense, cat-like eyes of a grayish-green hue, a feature noted by foreign chroniclers. He was quiet and watchful, possessed of a ferocious temper and an even more formidable willpower. He had a deep bond with his mother, Holland, and a strong sense of loyalty to his full brothers, Kassar, Kashun, and Timuj. He also had two half-brothers, Begtor and Belgatai, the sons of his father's second, lesser wife. Between Temujin and his older half-brother, Begtor, a subtle rivalry simmered. When Temujin was 9 years old, Yasuge decided it was time to find him a wife. Marriage among the nomads was a matter of politics, a tool for forging alliances. Yasuge took his eldest son and traveled east towards the lands of the Anjarat tribe, the people from whom his wife Holin had been stolen. It was a common practice to seek wives from the Anjarat, who were known for the beauty of their women. It was also a way to perhaps soothe the old wound with the Merkit, as the Anjarat were related to them. They came to the camp of an Anjarat chief named Desa Khan. The chief had a daughter, a girl a year older than Temujin, named Bert. She had a fair complexion and an intelligent fire in her eyes. Desa Khan had a dream the night before, a dream of a white falcon, clutching the sun and the moon in its talons, landing on his arm. He took this as a sign. An agreement was made. Temujin would stay with his future in-laws for a time, to learn their customs and to work for his bride, a form of bride price. Yeski, his duty done, left his son and began the long journey home. His path took him across the lands of the Tatars. He was thirsty and came upon a Tatar encampment where a celebration was underway. He did not announce himself, knowing the danger, but the Tatars recognized him. They knew him as the man who had defeated their chieftain years ago, the father of the boy named for their captured warrior. They could not attack him outright, for the laws of hospitality were sacred, even among the bitterest of enemies. So they smiled, and they offered him food and drink. And in the drink, they placed a slow-acting poison. Yasug rode on, but soon a fire began to burn in his belly. He grew weaker with every mile. He knew what had happened. He managed to reach his own camp to see his family one last time. He gathered his kinsmen and told them he was dying, that the Tatars had poisoned him. His last command was for someone to fetch Temujin to bring him home. He died in his ger, leaving behind 2 wives and 7 young children, a family suddenly cast adrift in a merciless world. A messenger was sent, and Temujin was brought back from the Anjarat camp. He returned not to the protection of a powerful father, but to a scene of chaos and despair. His world had shattered. The death of a chieftain was a moment of profound vulnerability for a nomadic clan. Yasuge's followers, the families and warriors who had sworn allegiance to him, now looked upon his widows and young children as a burden, not a responsibility. The real power among their extended clan, the Teashiod, lay with a chief named Targata Kareltuk, a distant kinsman. He saw no advantage in supporting the family of his dead rival. At the time of the spring migration, a ceremony was held to honor the ancestral spirits. Holin, as the widow of the late chief, expected to receive her share of the ritual offerings. But she and her family were ignored. The next morning, when she awoke, the camp was gone. The entire tribe, led by Targutai and the Talyashiods, had packed their gers and moved on, abandoning the family of their former leader to starve on the empty steppe. An old man who protested the decision was speared for his trouble. Holin, in a desperate fury, seized the clan's standard, the horsetail banner that was the soul of the tribe, and rode after them, shaming some of them into returning. But only for a short time. Ultimately, the decision stood. Holin, her 4 sons, her daughter, and her 2 stepsons, along with Yasuge's other widow, were left utterly alone. This was the ultimate betrayal, an act of cruelty that violated the deepest codes of kinship and loyalty. It was a lesson Temujin would never forget. He learned that alliances were fleeting, that blood was not always thicker than water, and that in the end, you could rely only on your own strength and the loyalty of the few you chose to trust. The abandonment plunged the family into a life of desperate poverty. The children of a proud chieftain were now reduced to the level of the lowest scavengers. Holin proved to be a woman of extraordinary fortitude. She refused to despair. She taught her children the arts of survival that noble children were not expected to know. She gathered pale berries and dug for wild roots. She fashioned fishing hooks from sewing needles and taught her sons to cast nets into the Aenon River. They hunted marmots and rats. Anything to keep starvation at bay. 'Twas a harsh and bitter existence, a constant battle against hunger and the elements. This period of hardship forged Temujin, but it also created fractures within the family. As the eldest, Temujin began to assert his authority. This brought him into direct conflict with his half-brother, Begter, who was slightly older and also had a claim to leadership. The tension between them was a power struggle in miniature. The fate of their small, desperate family hung in the balance. The conflict came to a head over a trivial matter, as such conflicts often do. Temujin and his brother Kassar had caught a small fish. Begtor and Belgatai, using their greater strength, simply took it from them. Another day, Temujin shot a lark with an arrow. Begter snatched it away. For Temujin, this was more than just the theft of food. It was a challenge to his status, a sign that Begter would not submit to his leadership. He saw in his half-brother's actions the same arrogance and disregard for others that he saw in Targutai and the Taishiads who had abandoned them. He went to his mother to complain, but Holin, weary of the infighting, scolded them all, reminding them that their only true enemies were the Taishiads, and that they should be united, like the 5 arrows in the parable of their ancestor Alan Goa, which could not be broken when bundled together. Temujin did not listen. He was convinced that the family could not survive with 2 masters. With his brother Kassar at his side, he stalked Begter, who was sitting on a small hill. Watching over the family's few horses, they approached him from the front and the back, their bows drawn. Begter knew what was coming. He did not beg for his life. He simply asked that they spare his full brother, Elgatay, and then sat impassively as his 2 half-brothers filled him with arrows. When they returned to the camp, Holin saw at once what they had done. Her grief turned to a terrifying rage. She screamed at her sons, calling them murderers, comparing them to dogs that eat their own afterbirth. She cursed them for their senseless violence, for destroying their own family when they were so beset by enemies. Temujin stood silent and impassive before his mother's fury. He had committed a terrible crime, fratricide, but in his cold, pragmatic mind, he had also solved a problem. He had eliminated a rival. He had established, once and for all, who was in command. As the years passed, Temujin grew into a strong young man. He was becoming a skilled hunter and a natural leader to his younger siblings. His reputation, the wolf cub of the late Yasuge, began to spread. It reached the ears of Targutai Kiriltuk. The Taishia chief grew fearful. The boy he had left to starve was now a man, and a man with a long and bitter memory. Targutai decided he had to eliminate the threat once and for all. He gathered a party of warriors and rode to Temujin's small camp. Temujin, alerted to their approach, fled into the dense forest of Turgun Heights, near Burkhan Khaldan. For 9 days, the Taishiads searched for him, but could not find him in the thick undergrowth. Finally, driven by hunger, Temujin emerged, only to be captured immediately. Targutai did not kill him. Instead, he subjected him to the ultimate humiliation. He had a kang, a heavy wooden collar, fastened around Temujin's neck and shoulders, binding his arms. He was now a slave, a helpless prisoner, paraded through the Taishid camps, a warning to any who might defy their authority. But even in this state of utter degradation, Temujin's will was not broken. He was watchful, waiting for his chance. One evening, the Taishiads were celebrating, drinking heavily. Temujin, under the guard of a single, lazy youth, saw his opportunity. He swung the heavy wooden kang, knocking his guard unconscious, and fled into the night. He ran to the nearby Ainen River and hid among the reeds, only his nose above the water. The Taishiads, realizing he had escaped, launched a frantic search. One of the searchers was a man named Sorkin Shira from a lesser clan. He spotted Temujin in the water, but instead of raising the alarm, he looked at the boy, at the fire and defiance in his eyes, and saw something more than a fugitive slave. He saw a future leader. He told Temujin to stay hidden and rode on, misleading the other searchers. Later that night, Sorkin Shira returned. He led Temujin to his family's ger, removed the kang, and gave him food and shelter. He hid him in a cart piled high with wool, and when the Taishiad search parties came by, he calmly sent them on their way. Sorkin Shira and his family had risked everything to save a stranger. It was a lesson in loyalty that Temujin would cherish. He had been betrayed by his noble kinsman and saved by a commoner. He learned that true allegiance was a matter of character, not of blood. After his escape, Temujin eventually found his family and began the slow process of rebuilding his life. He was no longer a boy. He was a man, forged in betrayal, starvation, slavery, and escape. His first priority was to claim his bride. He journeyed back to the lands of the Anjarat, to the camp of Daiseken. He was a poor and landless fugitive, but he was the son of Yasuge, and the betrothal was a matter of honor. To his relief, Daiseken and his wife welcomed him. They had kept their word. Bert, now a young woman, was given to him in marriage. Her mother presented the young couple with a magnificent wedding gift. A cloak made from the pelts of the finest black sables, an item of incredible value and prestige on the steppe. Temujin now had a wife, but he still had no followers, no power. He knew he could not survive alone. He needed a patron, a powerful ally who could offer him protection. He remembered the stories his father had told of his Anda, or blood brother, a man named Tagriel, the Khan of the powerful Karak tribe. The Karat were a large and prosperous tribe of Nestorian Christians, located to the west. Taking Bert's sable cloak, the only thing of value he possessed, Temujin traveled to Tagriel's court. He presented the cloak to the Khan, not as a gift from a supplicant, but as a symbolic gesture, stating that since his father was dead, Tagriel was now like a father to him. Tagriel, moved by the gesture and remembering his bond with Yasuge, accepted. He promised to protect Temujin and to help him gather his scattered people. In one shrewd diplomatic move, Temujin had secured the most powerful ally on the Mongolian steppe. He also sought out another alliance, one rooted in his childhood. Before his father's death, Temujin had befriended a boy from another clan named Jamuka. They had played together as children, exchanging knucklebones and vowing to be blood brothers, Anda forever. Now, as a young man, Temujin found Jamuka again. Jamuka had become a charismatic and successful war leader in his own right. They renewed their childhood oath in a solemn ceremony, drinking from a cup containing a mixture of their own blood. They were now sworn brothers, pledged to support each other until death. With the patronage of Tagriel Khan and the personal alliance with the formidable Jamuka, Temujin's fortunes were finally beginning to turn. His newfound security, however, was about to be shattered. The past had a long memory on the steppe. The Merkit tribe had never forgotten the abduction of Holin decades earlier. Now they saw their chance for revenge. The son of the man who had stolen their kinswoman was a young upstart with a new bride. One morning, just before dawn, a large force of Merkit warriors descended upon Temujin's small, undefended camp. The sound of their thundering hooves was the only warning. Temujin, his family, and a few retainers fled on horseback into the slopes of Burkhan Khaldan. But in the chaos, Bert was left behind. The Merkit warriors seized her and rode off into the sunrise. a prize of vengeance. For Temujin, this was a catastrophe. It was a personal agony, the loss of his beloved wife, but it was also a public humiliation of the worst kind. A man who could not protect his own wife could not hope to lead others. He did not succumb to despair. He channeled his grief into a cold, focused rage. He would get her back. He rode to the court of Togrul Khan and to the camp of his Anda Jamuka. He told them what had happened and invoked their oaths. He asked for their help. Togrul, seeing a chance to assert his authority and reward a loyal vassal, agreed to provide a massive army of 20,000 Karaite warriors. Jamuka, bound by his oath of blood brotherhood, also pledged his forces. For months, they planned their campaign. This would be Temujin's first real taste of war, his first command. He was no longer a fugitive fighting for survival. He was in commander, leading a great army to avenge his honor. The combined force of Karaite and Mongol warriors fell upon the unsuspecting Merkid encampment in the dead of night. The attack was a complete surprise. In the ensuing chaos, Temujin rode through the camp, shouting Bert's name. Hearing his voice, she came running from a cart, and they were reunited in the midst of the battle. The Merkid were utterly routed, their tribes scattered, their wealth plundered. The rescue of Bert was a turning point. Temujin had proven himself. He had faced a personal disaster and had responded with decisive action. He had successfully marshaled the support of powerful allies and had led a victorious military campaign. His reputation soared. Warriors from other clans, impressed by his courage and his success, began to leave their own chieftains and join his growing band of followers. After the victory, the camps of Temujin and Jamuka traveled together for a year and a half. Their friendship was rekindled, and they were as close as they had been in their youth. But beneath the surface, the seeds of a future rivalry were being sown. The two men, though blood brothers, had fundamentally different philosophies of leadership. Jamuka was a traditionalist, an aristocrat who believed in the old ways. That leadership was the birthright of the noble clans. He was charming and popular, but he maintained a distance between himself and the common warriors. Temujin was different. His experiences had taught him that loyalty and ability were more important than noble birth. He promoted men based on merit, not lineage. He shared the hardships of his followers, and he shared the spoils of victory with them. Former enemies, common shepherds, and the sons of blacksmiths could rise to positions of command in his camp if they proved their worth. This revolutionary approach inspired a fierce and intensely personal loyalty among his followers. The difference between the two leaders became apparent to everyone. A quiet exodus began as families and warriors from Jamuka's camp migrated to join Temujin, whom they saw as a more dynamic and egalitarian leader. The split, when it came, was inevitable. One day, Jamuka made a cryptic remark, suggesting that they should camp separately, he on the mountain with the goat herds, and Temujin in the valley with the shepherds. It was a subtle assertion of his superior status. Temujin's wife, Bert, wise to the ways of steppe politics, understood the hidden meaning. She urged her husband to break from Jamuka immediately. That night, Temujin and his followers rode on without Jamuka, and when morning came, many of Jamuka's own people had followed him. The friendship was broken, and a great rivalry had begun. Not long after, the followers of Temujin, coalition of his own Borgagin clan and defectors from numerous others, gathered for a Kurultai, a great council. They raised him on a piece of black felt and declared him their Khan. It was a modest title, the Khan of a small but growing confederation, but it was the first formal recognition of his leadership. He began to organize his people, or Ulus, in a new way. He appointed his most trusted companions, men like Bawarku and Gelm, who had been with him since the beginning, to high command. He created a personal bodyguard of elite warriors, the Keshig, who would one day become the Praetorian Guard of an empire. His rise to the rank of Khan made a confrontation with Jamuka unavoidable. Jamuka, incensed by Temujin's growing power and the defection of his followers, gathered a coalition of tribes loyal to the old aristocratic order. The pretext for war came when one of Jamuka's relatives was killed while trying to steal horses from Temujin's people. Jamuka raised an army of 30,000 and attacked. In the ensuing battle, known as the Battle of Dalan Baljat, Temujin was defeated and forced to retreat. Jamuka's victory was complete, but his actions in its aftermath were a disastrous miscalculation. To punish the chieftains who had sided with his rival, he had 70 of them boiled alive in a row of great cauldrons. This act of extreme cruelty horrified the people of the steppe. It was seen not as a show of strength, but of barbaric tyranny. In contrast, Temujin's rule, with its emphasis on justice and fair distribution of spoils, seemed far more appealing. Jamuka's cruelty drove even more warriors to abandon him and flock to Temujin's standard. The defeat at Dalan Baljet was a tactical loss for Temujin, but a great strategic victory. The next decade was a long and grueling period of constant warfare, a struggle to survive and expand in the deadly political landscape of the steppe. Temujin slowly and methodically began to eliminate his rivals. He waged a campaign of vengeance against the Tatars, not only to avenge his father's murder, but to absorb their military power. He instituted a revolutionary new rule of engagement. No warrior was to stop and loot during a battle. The battle had to be won first, and only then would all the plunder be collected and distributed centrally and fairly by the Khan himself. This simple rule transformed the Mongol way of war from a chaotic raid into a disciplined military operation. It bound his soldiers to him, ensuring their loyalty through a system of predictable reward. After a decisive victory, he had all adult Tatar men executed. A brutal but effective way of ensuring that the tribe could never rise again to threaten him. He absorbed their women, children, and wealth into his own growing nation. He then turned his attention to his old enemies, the Taishiads, who had abandoned him as a child and enslaved him as a youth. In a great battle, he shattered their forces. The Taishad chief, Targatai Kiriltuk, was killed. During the battle, Temujin himself was grievously wounded, an arrow piercing his neck. And he was saved only by the heroic actions of his loyal companion Jelm, who sucked the poisoned blood from the wound. The archer who had shot him, a man named Zergadai, was later captured. When brought before Temujin, he boldly admitted his deed. Impressed by his courage, Temujin spared his life, gave him a new name, Jib, meaning arrow, and took him into his service. Jib would go on to become one of his greatest and most loyal generals. Temujin's power was growing exponentially. He was no longer just another tribal chief, but a major force, a vortex pulling the fractured peoples of the steppe into a new unity. His last great rivals within Mongolia were his one-time patron, Genghis Khan of the Karaite, and the powerful Nayman tribe in the far west. Togrul, now an old man, was increasingly swayed by his ambitious son, Sengam, who was deeply jealous of Temujin's success. Sengam, in alliance with the ever-present Jamuka, convinced his father that Temujin was a threat who had to be destroyed. The Karaite launched a surprise attack, catching Temujin's forces unprepared and scattering them. For a time, it seemed as if all was lost. But Temujin's core followers remained loyal. He rallied his men, and in a series of brilliant tactical maneuvers, he lured the overconfident Karaite army into a final, decisive confrontation. The ensuing battle lasted for 3 days and nights. 'Twas a desperate, bloody affair, but in the end, Temujin's superior discipline and the fanatical loyalty of his warriors won the day. The Karaite army was broken. Togrul and his son fled, only to be killed by Nayman border guards who did not recognize them. The great Karaite tribe, once the most powerful on the steppe, was no more. Temujin absorbed their people, their herds, and their territory into his own burgeoning nation. By the year 1204, Temujin stood as the undisputed master of the eastern and central steppes. Only one major power remained to oppose him: the Nayman tribe, who controlled the western part of Mongolia. The Nayman Khan, Taeyong, had given shelter to Jamuka, Temujin's old friend and implacable foe. The final act of the unification war was about to begin. Temujin had endured betrayal, poverty, and slavery. He had avenged his family, rescued his wife, and defeated tribe after tribe. He had forged a new kind of army, loyal only to him, and a new kind of society built on merit and law. He was no longer just Temujin of the Borjigin clan. He was the master of a nation, standing on the verge of being recognized as the supreme ruler of all the people of the Feldwald Tents, the ruler of all Mongolia. The final confrontation for the mastery of the steppe came in the spring of 1204. Temujin gathered his forces. A disciplined and battle-hardened army forged in 2 decades of relentless warfare. He marched west into the Altai Mountains, the heartland of the Naiman tribe. The Naiman Kantayang was a proud and powerful ruler, but he regarded Temujin and his followers as impoverished upstarts. He underestimated his enemy, a fatal mistake. The two armies met in a great battle at the foot of Mount Nak. The Naiman forces were numerous, but they were a traditional tribal coalition. See their loyalties divided. Temujin's army fought as a single entity, a disciplined machine of war moving with a terrifying unity of purpose. The battle raged all day. Temujin's generals, men like the peerless Subutai, the valiant Jib, and the wise Mukali, executed a series of brilliant flanking maneuvers. As dusk fell, the Naiman lines broke. Tayang Khan was mortally wounded, and his army dissolved into a panicked rout. Jamuka, Temujin's blood brother and bitter rival, who had been fighting with the Naiman, fled the battlefield, his last hope of stopping his old friend now shattered. With the fall of the Naiman, the last major resistance to Temujin's rule was crushed. Over the next few months, his generals hunted down the remnants of the enemy. Jamuka, abandoned by his few remaining followers, was eventually captured and brought before Temujin. The meeting between the two men who had once sworn eternal brotherhood was freighted with the weight of their shared history. Temujin, it is said, was reluctant to kill his old Anda. He offered Jamuka a renewal of their friendship, a high position in his new order. But Jamuka refused. He had been born to be a Khan, and he would not live as a subordinate. He told Temujin that just as there was only room for one sun in the sky, there was only room for one ruler on the steppe. He asked for a noble death, one without the shedding of blood, as was the custom for royalty. Temujin granted his request. Jamuka was taken away, and his back was broken by his captors. His life ending not with a sword, but in the quiet embrace of the steppe. With Jamuka's death, the final obstacle was removed. Temujin was now the sole and undisputed master of all the tribes of Mongolia. In the spring of 1206, at the headwaters of the Anan River, he summoned a great Kurultai, a grand assembly of all the chieftains of the steppe. Thousands gathered, a sea of gers and horsehair banners stretching to the horizon. It was a moment of profound significance, the birth of a nation. On a high platform under a great white standard with 9 horse tails, representing the soul of his people, Temujin was raised on a sheet of felt by the leaders of the assembled tribes. They bestowed upon him a new title, a name that would echo through history with a sound like the rushing of a storm. He was no longer Temujin of the Borjigin clan. He was the Kagan, the Khan of Khans. He was Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, the universal lord. This was not just a coronation. It was a revolution. Genghis Khan immediately set about dismantling the old tribal world that had bred nothing but division and endless warfare, and replacing it with something entirely new. He reorganized the entire Mongol society along military lines. He broke up the old, unreliable tribes and clans, scattering their members among new decimal units. All able-bodied men were now soldiers, organized into units of 10 Arban, 100 Zuan, 1,000 Mingen, and 10,000 Tumen. Command of these units was given not to the old hereditary chieftains, but to his most loyal and capable companions, men who owed their positions entirely to him. Loyalty was no longer to the clan or the tribe, but to the Khan alone. This system, the Mongol, militarized the entire nation and created a unified, disciplined fighting force of unprecedented scale and cohesion. He established a formal legal code, the Yasa, or Great Law. The Yasa was never written down in its entirety in a single document, but its principles were absolute. It was a harsh and pragmatic code designed to enforce order and discipline. It made crimes like theft, adultery, and, above all, treason punishable by death. It forbade the kidnapping of women and the enslavement of any Mongol. It established rules for hospitality, for the fair distribution of plunder, and for the preservation of the environment, making it a capital offense to pollute rivers or to start grass fires needlessly. The Yasa provided a common law for a people who had never known one, binding all Mongols from the lowest commoner to the Khan's own sons under a single, unyielding standard of justice. He also created a new imperial guard, the Kashig, an elite corps of 10,000 warriors drawn from the sons of his commanders. They served as his personal bodyguard, the guardians of his household, and the core of his army. To serve in the Kashig was the highest honor, and it created an intensely loyal officer corps that was also a training ground for future generals and administrators. He ordered the adoption of a writing system, using the script of the conquered name and tribe, so that his laws and decrees could be recorded. He established a postal relay system, the Yam, a network of stations with fresh horses and riders that could carry messages and intelligence across the vast distances of the steppe with astonishing speed. With his nation unified, organized, and disciplined, Genghis Khan now looked outward. The steppe itself was too poor to sustain his new state and his vast army. A nomadic empire could only survive through conquest by extracting the wealth of the rich, sedentary civilizations that lay beyond its borders. His first target was the kingdom of Shishai, ruled by the Tangut people, a wealthy state that controlled a crucial section of the Silk Road in what is now northwestern China. The campaign, which began in 1209, was a brutal education for the Mongols in a new kind of warfare. Here were not open plains, but fortified cities with massive walls, moats, and garrisons of well-armed infantry. The Mongols were masters of mobile warfare, of the lightning raid and the feigned retreat. But siegecraft was new to them. They learned quickly and ruthlessly. It would surround a city, cutting off all supplies and communication. They would use captured prisoners as human shields, driving them before their armies to absorb the first volleys of arrows. They diverted rivers to flood cities or to deprive them of water. They employed captured engineers to build siege engines, catapults, battering rams, and siege towers. And they perfected the art of psychological warfare. They offered generous terms to cities that surrendered without a fight. But for those that resisted, the retribution was terrible. When a city fell after a long siege, its population was often systematically massacred, a horrifying object lesson to other cities in their path. After a bloody and difficult campaign, the Tangut king submitted, agreeing to become a vassal of the Khan, to pay a huge tribute, and to provide military support for future campaigns. The Mongols now had a foothold in China and access to the vast wealth of the Silk Road. Genghis Khan's next target was far more ambitious, the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin were the traditional overlords of the eastern steppe. They had treated the nomads with contempt for generations, instigating conflicts between the tribes and carrying out periodic campaigns to cull the Mongol population. For Genghis Khan, this was a war of revenge and of destiny. He believed that the eternal sky, Tengri, had given him a mandate to rule the world, and the Jin were the first great empire that stood in his way. In 1211, the Mongol horde, perhaps 100,000 strong, poured south through the Great Wall. The Jin Empire was vast and populous, with a huge army of its own. But it was a sedentary empire, its forces scattered in garrisons and fortresses. The Mongols swept across the plains of northern China like a natural disaster. They avoided costly assaults on major fortifications, instead devastating the countryside, destroying crops, and cutting supply lines. Jin armies that sallied out to meet them in the open field were annihilated by the Mongols' superior mobility and tactical brilliance. At the Battle of the Badger Mouth Pass, a vast Jin army was lured into a narrow gorge and slaughtered, a victory that opened the way to the heart of the Jin Empire. The Mongols besieged, captured, and sacked dozens of cities. In 1215, they reached the Jin capital, Jiangdu, the site of modern-day Beijing. After a long and desperate siege, the city fell. The Mongols plundered it for a month, massacring a large portion of its population and burning it to the ground. The Jin emperor fled south to a new capital, but the heart of his empire had been ripped out. The conquest of northern China was a long, drawn-out affair, lasting for more than 2 decades. But the campaign had a profound effect on Genghis Khan. It was here that he began to understand the value of more than just plunder. He encountered new ideas and new technologies. He learned the importance of administration and of using the skills of conquered peoples. He began to incorporate Chinese siege engineers, scholars, and administrators into his growing empire, including a Khitan nobleman named Yelu Chukai, who would become a trusted advisor and would famously tell the Khan that while an empire could be conquered on horseback, it could not be ruled from horseback. With the Jin dynasty crippled, a new and unexpected crisis erupted in the West. Genghis Khan had sought to establish peaceful trade relations with the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and powerful Muslim sultanate that stretched across Persia and Central Asia. In 1218, he sent a large trade caravan with several hundred merchants and a diplomatic envoy to the Khwarezmian frontier city of Otrar. The governor of the city, a man named Inalhuk, was suspicious and greedy. He accused the merchants of being spies, seized their valuable goods, and had the entire caravan executed. When news of the massacre reached Genghis Khan, his reaction was one of cold, murderous fury. This was more than just the murder of his subjects. It was a profound insult to his honor as Khan, a violation of the sacred laws of diplomacy and hospitality. He sent another envoy to the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad II, demanding that the governor of Otrar be handed over for punishment. The Shah, an arrogant and indecisive ruler, not only refused but had the chief Mongol envoy executed and the beards of his companions burned. The ultimate humiliation. This act sealed the fate of the Khwarezmian Empire. For Genghis Khan, this was no longer a matter of trade or border disputes. It was a holy war of vengeance. He assembled the largest Mongol army ever seen, a force of well over 100,000 battle-hardened veterans, and, in the year 1219, he unleashed a storm upon Central Asia. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire was a masterpiece of military strategy and a campaign of unparalleled brutality. The Shah expected the Mongols to attack from the east along the traditional invasion routes. Instead, Genghis Khan divided his forces. He sent one army as a feint, while he personally led the main force on an epic and seemingly impossible march. He guided his army across the forbidding Kizilkum Desert, a vast, waterless wasteland emerging completely unexpectedly deep in the Khwarezmian heartland, far to the west of the Shah's main armies. The Mongols fell upon the great cities of the Silk Road like a pack of wolves. The city of Otrar, where the caravan had been murdered, was besieged. After a long and desperate resistance, it fell. The governor, Inalhuk, was captured alive as a punishment for his greed. Genghis Khan reportedly had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. One by one, the legendary cities of Central Asia were targeted. Bukhara, a center of learning and culture, was taken. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the city's main mosque, climbed the pulpit, and declared to the terrified city elders that he was the flail of God, sent by heaven to punish them for their sins. The city was sacked and burned, its population massacred or enslaved. Next came Samarkand, one of the richest and most magnificent cities in the world. It too was besieged and taken. Its garrison of elite Turkish mercenaries lured out of the city and annihilated. The city's artisans and skilled craftsmen were spared, to be sent back to work in the Mongol capital, but much of the rest of the population was put to the sword. Shah Muhammad II, his armies shattered and his strategy in ruins, fled west, pursued relentlessly by a Mongol detachment led by the brilliant generals Jib and Subutai. This legendary pursuit, which would cover thousands of miles, saw the Shah hunted from city to city until he died, a broken and destitute fugitive on a small island in the Caspian Sea. The destruction visited upon this Khwarezmian Empire was on a scale that the world had rarely seen. It was a demographic catastrophe. Entire provinces were laid waste, their ancient and sophisticated irrigation systems. The keynotes that had sustained life for centuries were destroyed, turning fertile farmland back into desert. Great cities that had been centers of civilization for 1,000 years were reduced to smoldering ruins. The historic region of Khorasan in eastern Persia was particularly devastated. At the cities of Merv and Nishapur, the Mongol armies, according to contemporary chroniclers, whose numbers are likely exaggerated, but reflect the horror of the events, systematically massacred over 1 million people at each site, building gruesome pyramids of skulls as a testament to their victory. This was not mindless slaughter. It was a deliberate strategy of terror, designed to extinguish any possibility of future resistance and to send a chilling message across the world. But amidst the destruction, the Mongol conquest also created something new. By shattering the old empires and uniting a vast territory under a single rule, Genghis Khan created the largest contiguous land empire in history. He secured the Silk Road from end to end. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, a merchant could travel safely from the shores of the Black Sea to the coast of China. The Yam relay system facilitated not just military communication, but also trade and the exchange of ideas. Paper money, gunpowder, printing, and the compass began to travel from east to west, while Western science, medicine, and art flowed east. The Mongols, for all their brutality, had become the unlikely agents of a new era of global connection. While Jib and Subutai continued their great raid, a reconnaissance in force that would take them around the Caspian Sea through the Caucasus, mountains, and into the Russian steppes, defeating every army that stood in their path, Genghis Khan remained in Central Asia, consolidating his conquest. He oversaw the final subjugation of the remaining Khwarezmian forces led by the Shah's heroic son, Jalal al-Din, who was finally defeated at the Battle of the Indus. By 1225, Genghis Khan was in his 60s. In less than 2 decades, he had transformed his people from a collection of warring tribes into the masters of a vast empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. He had conquered northern China and had utterly destroyed the most powerful Muslim empire of his time. He was the most powerful man on earth. He decided it was time to return to Mongolia, his homeland. But his work was not done. The Tanga kingdom of Shah, which had pledged allegiance to him years before, had refused to provide troops for the Khwarezmian campaign, an act of insubordination he could not ignore. The mandate of the Eternal Sky was not yet complete. New campaigns of conquest were already being planned. Campaigns that would push Mongol armies to the gates of Europe and to the final subjugation of all of China. The great Khan was coming home, but the storm he had unleashed upon the world was far from over. The long journey home from the ravaged heartlands of Central Asia was a migration of empire. It was a slow, inexorable river of people and livestock, of plundered wealth and captive minds. Flowing eastward across the plains, back toward the sacred mountains and clear rivers of the Mongolian homeland, Genghis Khan, now in his early 60s, rode at the head of this vast procession. He had left Mongolia as the chieftain of a newly united nomadic people. He was returning as the master of the known world. He had shattered the great Khwarezmian Empire, erased ancient cities from the map, and extended his dominion to the shores of the Caspian Sea. He had seen things no Mongol had ever seen, wealth beyond imagining, and civilizations of dazzling complexity. Yet, as he rode, his gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the familiar landscape of his youth. The world he had conquered was a source of power and wealth, but Mongolia was his soul. He established his imperial camp, his Orju, in the Khenti Mountains, near the headwaters of the Anon River, the site of his ascendancy. He ordered the building of a capital, a city to be called Karakoram. It was not to be a great metropolis of stone in the manner of the cities he had destroyed. It was a Mongol capital, a city of felt gears, of mobile palaces, and of modest administrative buildings. A symbol that even in their greatness, they remained a people of the steppe. Karakoram quickly became the nerve center of the empire, a crossroads where Uyghur scribes, Chinese engineers, Persian merchants, and Nestorian priests mingled with Mongol generals. It was a testament to the Khan's pragmatism, a place where the skills of all conquered peoples were harnessed for the benefit of the Mongol state. In this new capital, he rested, but he did not rule as a sedentary king. He spent his time hunting, consulting with his shamans, and meeting with his sons and generals in great councils. He oversaw the consolidation of his vast conquests. His laws, the Yasa, were enforced from the Yellow Sea to Persia. His postal relay system, the Yam, now crisscrossed Asia, its riders carrying decrees, intelligence reports, and tribute across thousands of miles with incredible speed. A merchant with a Mongol passport, a small tablet of authority called a pesa, could travel from one end of the empire to the other in relative safety, a feat unimaginable just a decade earlier. But for the great Khan, there was unfinished business. An oath had been broken, an act of defiance that gnawed at his sense of order. The Tangut kingdom of Shisha had refused his summons. Their king had insulted him. Such an act could not go unpunished. It was a challenge not just to his authority, but to the authority of the eternal sky itself. In the autumn of 1226, the great white horsetail banners were raised once more. The old Khan, his body beginning to feel the weight of his years, but his spirit as unyielding as forged iron, led his army south for his final campaign. He knew this would be a different kind of war. The campaign against Khwarezm had been a war of vengeance and expansion. This was to be a war of extermination. He moved not with the lightning speed of his earlier campaigns, but with the slow, grinding, inexorable force of a glacier. He meant to erase the Tangut kingdom from the memory of the world. The Mongol army poured into Shai, a land of harsh deserts and heavily fortified oasis cities. The campaign was a masterclass in methodical destruction. They captured city after city. Those that surrendered were spared immediate massacre. Their populations registered and their young men conscripted into labor battalions to work the siege engines at the next city. Those that resisted were subjected to the full measure of Mongol fury. The fighting was brutal and desperate. The Tanguts, knowing their fate, fought with a suicidal courage, but they could not stop the tide. As the campaign ground on through the brutal winter, Genghis Khan took part in one of his favorite pastimes, a great circular hunt. But in the midst of the chase, as he pursued a herd of wild asses, his horse shied and threw him. He was a man who had lived his life in the saddle, but age had stiffened his limbs. The fall was a heavy one, and he suffered grave internal injuries. His commanders and sons urged him to abandon the campaign and return to Mongolia to recover. But Genghis Khan's will was absolute. He refused. To retreat would be seen as a sign of weakness. He would not give his enemies that satisfaction. He lay in his ger, burning with a high fever, his body racked with pain, but his mind remained as sharp and as cold as a shard of winter ice. He continued to direct the war from his sickbed, his orders carried by messengers to the front lines. The siege of the Tangut capital, Zhongshan, continued relentlessly. He knew that his life was drawing to a close. The injury had awoken something fatal within him. His thoughts turned to the future, to the vast, unprecedented empire he had created. He knew that its greatest vulnerability was not the armies of its enemies, but the ambitions of his own sons. The question of succession, long a source of tension, now became an urgent crisis. His 4 sons by birth were the 4 pillars of his empire, but they were pillars that chafed against one another. The eldest, Joki, ruled the westernmost domains, but the stain of his parentage. The fact that he was born so soon after Bert's rescue from the Merkits had never been fully washed away. It was a weapon his brothers, particularly Chagatai, used against him. Joki was a capable and popular commander, but he was also growing increasingly independent in his distant lands. The second son, Chagatai, was a man of iron. He was the keeper of the Yasa, a harsh and uncompromising legalist who saw any deviation from his father's law as a personal affront. His temper was legendary, and his rigid adherence to tradition brought him into constant conflict with Joki, whom he once openly called a Merkit bastard. In his father's presence, Chagatai was respected, but he was not loved. He lacked the flexibility to rule a diverse, multicultural empire. The youngest, Tului, was a brilliant general, perhaps the most skilled warrior of the 4. He was a favorite of the Mongol army and the nobility of the heartland. As the youngest son, Mongol tradition dictated that he, the Adkhan or keeper of the hearth, would inherit his father's homeland. He was a staunch traditionalist, but his political skills were unproven. It was the 3rd son, Gadai, upon whom the Khan's hopes rested. Gadai was neither the best warrior nor the most brilliant strategist. He was, however, a man of immense personal charm, of boundless generosity, and of a conciliatory nature. He was a prodigious drinker, a weakness that worried his father. But he was the one son that all the others could and would accept. He was the keystone who could hold the arch of the empire together. In a tense and emotional council years before, Genghis Khan had formally designated Gadai as his successor, forcing his feuding brothers to swear an oath of allegiance. It was a decision born not of sentiment, but of cold political necessity. Now, lying in his lair on the plains of Shisha, he solidified his plans. The empire would be divided. Each son would have his own kingdom, his own ulus within the greater whole. Joki's sons, Batu and Orda, for Joki himself had died just months before his father, would inherit the western steppe from the Irtysh River to the Urals and beyond. Chagatai would rule the lands of Central Asia, the former territory of the Khwarezmians. Tului would serve as regent until a formal Kurultai could enthrone Gadai as the great Khan, and Gadai would be the supreme ruler, the center of their world. It was a structure designed to preserve unity through a balance of power, a gamble on his sons' ability to subordinate their own ambitions to his grand vision. In the late summer of 1227, the final surrender of the Tangut capital was being negotiated. Genghis Khan's strength finally failed him. He summoned his most trusted followers to his bedside. He gave them his final commands. His death was to be concealed. The Tanguts were to be lured into a false sense of security. And then, once their surrender was complete and their leaders had emerged from the city, they were all to be executed. The entire Tangut people, men, women, and children, were to be wiped from the face of the earth so that their rebellion would never be remembered. Having delivered this last terrible decree, he died. His inner circle carried out his orders with grim precision. The death of the great Khan was kept a profound secret. The Tangut king and his nobles emerged from their capital to offer their submission, only to be cut down. Then the Mongol armies fell upon the city and the surrounding countryside, and the final systematic slaughter of the Tangut people began. The funeral cortege then began its long, silent journey north, back to the sacred lands of Burkhan Khaldan. A vast area of the steppe was sealed off by thousands of warriors. According to legend, the soldiers of the funeral escort killed every person and every animal they encountered along the way, to serve their master in the spirit world and to ensure that no witness could ever reveal the location of his tomb. He was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, its location a secret known only to a handful of his most trusted guards, a secret they would take to their own graves. The earth was trampled flat by 1,000 horses, and trees were planted over the site, so that within a generation, the final resting place of the world's greatest conqueror, had vanished, merging forever with the sacred soil of his homeland. The empire he had created did not die with him. For a time, his vision held. His son Gedai was enthroned as the second great Khan, and the Mongol conquests continued with relentless momentum. Mongol armies, led by Genghis Khan's sons and his brilliant general Subutai, stormed across the plains of Russia, shattered the armies of Poland and Hungary at the gates of Vienna, completed the conquest of Jin China. His grandson Kublai would conquer the southern Song and rule as the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty in China. Another grandson, Hulagu, would sack Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and establish Mongol rule in Persia. At its peak, the Mongol Empire was a contiguous domain stretching from the Danube to the Pacific, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest empire the world has ever known. The legacy of Genghis Khan remains a complex and fiercely debated tapestry of extremes. For the nations he conquered, particularly in Persia, Central Asia, and Russia, his name is forever linked with massacre, destruction, and a terror so profound it was seen as a divine punishment. He was the scourge of God, a barbarian who destroyed ancient civilizations and left pyramids of skulls in his wake. Yet for Mongolia, he is the revered father of the nation, the lawgiver, the unifier, the man who gave his people a name and a place in history. He remains the central figure of their national identity, a symbol of strength, unity, and indomitable will. Beyond the stark duality of destroyer and creator, his impact on the course of world history is undeniable. The Pax Mongolica, the peace he imposed through conquest, created a single political and economic space across Eurasia. This unprecedented unity ignited a period of extraordinary intercontinental exchange. The Silk Road was revitalized, and the volume of trade and travel between East and West reached levels never seen before. It was this Mongol-created global network that allowed for the journey of Marco Polo. But it also facilitated the spread of ideas, technologies, and, tragically, disease. The Black Death, which would devastate Europe in the 14th century, traveled from the east along these same Mongol-protected trade routes. He was a military revolutionary who created an army whose discipline, tactics, and mobility were centuries ahead of its time. He was a political visionary who created a durable state from the most unpromising of materials. He was a ruler who, despite his own illiteracy, understood the value of writing, of law, and of administration. He embraced a policy of religious tolerance that stood in stark contrast to the fanaticism of his age. Ultimately, Genghis Khan was a figure of transition. He was the last of the great nomadic conquerors, a man who emerged from an ancient world of tribal blood feuds. But he was also the first architect of a truly global age, a man who broke down the barriers between civilizations and, through the sheer force of his will, forced the world into a new and violent intimacy. His empire would eventually fragment, its Mongol rulers assimilated into the cultures they had conquered. But the connections he forged, the new world he created out of the wreckage of the old, would endure. He was born in a felt tent, clutching a clot of blood, and died the master of a vast empire. His story is not just the story of a single man, but the story of the violent birth of the modern, interconnected world.